Africa Health Futures and serves on the steering committee of the People's Health Movement. Shehnaz will be giving us a talk that ties up the question around opportunities for sustainability research, but also looks at some examples within her area of practice, which is in health systems. Shehnaz, please, whenever you're ready, you can join us.
Hi. I hope you can see me clearly and hear me clearly. Thank you so much for having me here today. And this is an absolute delight for me to be here, to be invited by a group of Africans to speak together in conversation, and to be speaking to an audience that's quite international, but also quite deeply interested in thinking about better ways of being in the world and better ways of doing things that can lead us towards this goal that you talk about in terms of sustainability and in terms of understanding who we are and where we want to go and redefining a new future. And I feel quite honored to be part of this, because this is a kind of a conversation that I am part of and would love to continue conversing with you beyond this lecture. So today, the limits of my talk is not to discuss my work or the ways in which I'm applying a decolonial methodology, but rather to step back and to take us into a space where we can begin to understand some of the terminology and all kind of bring us all to the same page. So I would love to hear from you. I've got a email with all of your names, and I think in the chat room and in the time where we do converse, I would love to be able to hear more about who you are and what you're doing, and please introduce yourself in the chat box so we can keep conversing through this conversation. And I apologize for the very lecture style in the beginning, but I think that will bring us to a point where we can move forward. Is my sound clear, and is everybody okay with that?
Yes, I can hear you loud and clear. Yes.
Excellent. Okay, so I'm going to start at the beginning. I hope you can see my slide, and there we go. So I am part of an organization with my colleague Lance Luskiter and Kense Radebe called the Africa Health Futures Project. This is a project that we had started last year, or officially started last year, when we launched a Africa Health convening, where we brought together African health researchers into the same space to discuss decoloniality. We did this under the banner of Health Systems Global, which is a health systems and policy research space. But we were also part funded by the Atlantic Philanthropies. And this is significant because we were not targeting simply health researchers, but we were targeting all those who work in various spaces, practically, intellectually, and on the ground doing development work in Africa, whatever that means. And I mean, in whatever space you are doing your development work, to really think about broadening our horizon, to think around decoloniality, and to think about new ways of doing things. And I suppose in conversation, we had 3 days, and you can have a look on YouTube to see those videos that are available to be part of our conversation further. In that conversation, we also had many African scholars. Also with, I was quite lucky to be invited by Joel to do another conversation in which we unpack some more thoughts. That's also recorded. So just to say that there is a lot of resources out there. If people are interested in trying to really get to grips with this topic and really, deepen their understanding and move from the theoretical to the practical and back to the theoretical, and to kind of develop a decolonial reflexive praxis, which is something I deeply encourage. So to start off with this lecture, I want to kind of draw attention to a important decolonial scholar, Ramón Grosfuegal, who is from Puerto Rico, and where many, in South America, many decolonial scholars reside. And he made it clear that there is this myth of the post-colonial world. And he said that one of the most powerful myths of the 20th century is the notion that the elimination of the colonial administrations amounted to the decolonization of the world. Instead, he says this heterogeneous and multiple global structures that were put in place 450 years ago did not evaporate with the judicial political decolonization of the periphery over the past 50 years. So what he's saying is this historical event that happened over 450 years ago, it marks and shapes our lives in the most significant ways. And we actually need to be very cognizant of this and pay attention to it. And this is the crux of my lecture today. And what he says is that we continue to live under the same colonial matrix of power. So in order for us to really understand what Ramón Grosfuegal is trying to say, we first need to unpack and be on the same page with some of the definitions. So I invite you to read the definitions that I've brought out, and I would like you to find your own definition so that we can have these engagements and move the conversation forward. So the first important terminology to be aware of is colonialism. And here I invite you to look at this picture, something that many of us are quite familiar with. And this picture is one that shows these African people in the background and these two white men in front. The white men are, examining a wound on this man's back. And you see a kind of power asymmetry, but it looks like a very wonderful thing. These two white men are coming to heal this person who is in immense pain. But we need to look a bit deeper. We need to understand that colonialism is a very complex power structure that has transformed a people's way of life. And it's an invention of an asymmetrical power relationship where you have a kind of intercolonial, intersubjective relationship between those who are the colonizers and those who are the colonized. And in this case, what the colonial project did is it made those who are the colonizers, so the two white men in front, citizens, and the colonized who are in the background, the subjects. So it didn't just stop there, it was an economic project too. And it instituted dispossession and transfer of economic resources from those who are indigenous to those who are conquering and foreign. And this project, as we can see in this picture, it looks quite civilizing. It looks quite, good, but actually hidden behind colonialism, it's quite a sinister project. So what is important is for us to understand that if I go 2 slides back, we talk about this idea that Ramón has warned us that we are not in a post-colonial world, that actually these people in the background who are standing around and this woman in this picture here, there's something quite similar. And the similarities is what we need to unpack. And I want you to reflect on what these similarities are for yourself. Firstly, she's quite clearly saying she's silenced. So this colonial power that has stayed with us, it's got a term, and this term is coloniality. So coloniality is that condition that has survived beyond colonization. And it's an invisible power structure that sustains colonial relations of exploitation and domination long after the end of direct colonization. And another Puerto Rican scholar, Nelson Maldonado Torres, talks about this idea that we breathe it in as modern subjects. We breathe in coloniality every day. So what is this colonial matrix of power? Okay, what it is actually an organizing principle of colonization. And it actually interacts with each other and enables coloniality to reproduce itself. And it sits in the form of racism, heteropatriarchy, and capitalism. And these three elements, they build on power asymmetries in all areas of life, and they result in economic disposition. And what we need to understand is the structural determinants of health, of education, of climate destruction, and all sorts of fields that exist. And in order for us to move forward, we need to use these principles of racism, of heteropatriarchy, and of capitalism. We need to understand them. And then they need to inform a decolonial framework of thinking that will help us disrupt some of these ideas. So what can we do with this decolonial lens? So we argue that the injustices of the world have its roots in the colonial project. And we need to ask ourselves, and I need to ask myself, how does the past live in my presence from where I stand, from my standpoint? How does the past live in my present? Then we need to develop a real deep, rich understanding of how these organizing principles of racism, heteropatriarchy, and capitalism are entrenched. In my field, I'm just using global public health as my field as an example, but I urge you to replace global public health with education, with environmental well-being, with whichever field that you are in, okay? And so the idea is that there is a long haul project. There's no magic silver bullet. Okay? And so what we need to do is politicize our research. We need to see it as a tool, and we need to see it as part of a social justice project. So what do I mean by politicizing research? And in this particular summer school, your goal is methodology. And when you are taking an intentional decolonial approach, you somewhat have to understand that you introduce a bias, and your bias is social justice. And you're using research as a tool to deepen knowledge and further a particular agenda of social justice. Because ultimately, decoloniality is not a neutral project. It's actually quite an intentional liberation project. Okay, we need to act to disrupt coloniality. So you've got to ask yourself, what does disruption mean for me? And again, I'm using the health example because that's my field, but I want you to ask in your field, what does it mean for you? How are you joining a revolution? And actually, are you prepared to distribute your economic, financial, intellectual power? Am I prepared to distribute mine, or am I prepared to give it over? And what this requires for us is, as we embark on decolonial methodology, decolonial ways of being, decolonial ways of doing, decolonial theorization, we need to develop a deep reflexive project and examine the ways in which we do things and the ways in which we reproduce colonial practices. Okay, so this is actually me calling all of us in this room, and I see that there are 23 of us complicit in the colonial project. And until we develop the deep reflexive praxis, we will continue to be complicit, because the methodologies that we've been taught in our education replicate the colonial project. And I'm hoping that we can have a discussion about this. I will look at the chat box at the end of the lecture, just to keep me on track. So again, I urge you to think back to this image And while this image may no longer exist, it does exist in other forms. And that's where we need to start opening our mind. So now let's go to away from colonialism and coloniality to another important term, decolonization. And just to clear it up, decolonization is the process through which you have direct colonial rule withdrawn. And if you look at the map of Africa, we can say most countries have undergone decolonization. I think the Western Sahara is one of the countries that is still colonized. Again, to reiterate, decolonization does not remove the effects of hundreds of years of colonial oppression. Another important term is then decoloniality. And this is the project of, this is why I've been invited to come and speak to you. This is what you are all interested in learning. And this is what we need to then unpack to figure out what are we going to do about this. And decoloniality is a political, epistemological, and economic liberation project aimed at dislodging coloniality and its manifestations, according to Zimbabwean decolonial scholar that I urge you to read, called Sabelo Ndlovu-Garcheni. So he talks about decoloniality as a practice, an ongoing project. It's about ways of doing and being in the world. My colleagues Lance, Kente, and I call it a conscientization project. And we unpacking and trying to understand what are the words like disruption, delinking, disentangling, liberation, reclamation, rebuilding. What do these kinds of words mean for us? And where are we going with it? So in order for us to then examine the colonial matrix of power, which I mentioned is racism, capitalism, heteropatriarchy. Where do they exist and how do they exist? We kind of need to unpack a little bit deeper and understand that there are many ways, and actually Ndlovu-Garcheni has talked to us about the way it manifests at multiple levels. And we're going to use 3 levels that he has described: coloniality of power, coloniality of being, and coloniality of knowledge. And in this particular summer school, I think most of you are interested in the coloniality of knowledge because you're interested in methodology, but you have to understand the coloniality of power and being as well. Okay, so we're going to deep dive into these concepts just to show you a brief overview, and I think what we're going to have in the discussion is maybe some unpacking and thinking together in your different fields of what does this mean. Okay, so we're going to discuss them as we go along. So what is the coloniality of power? So if you look at these pictures, you see basically at the start of last year, 2020, we had some people who are formed part of the C19 coalition, of which the People's Health Movement, a social movement I am part of, was standing outside the French embassy with this letter saying, you know, actually these 2 posters, the one saying Black Lives Matter, vaccines for all, and the other, dear France, it's your best chance to protect people, regards South Africa. And this idea of hashtag not farmer greed, no patent monopolies in a pandemic. So we need to examine what are the power asymmetries and where do they lie. And in this image, you'll see that the power asymmetries actually lie between France and the West, the global North, and those who are reliant on the patent monopoly power that's sitting with France, and those of us who live in low and middle income countries. And this social movement was urging France as a superpower to not be greedy, to share your patents, to allow everybody to have access to the technologies that will allow us to vaccinate everyone in the world. And I'm hoping that this is an example that's very relevant to all of us here. Okay. So coloniality of power refers to this asymmetrical power structures. And what we need to understand is that power is used as a technology of domination, control, exploitation, and violence. And it forms part of this colonial matrix of power that I introduced much earlier. Another decolonial scholar to look out for from South America is Cochuano. And so it's about these structural processes within the global imperial design that determine who is superior, who is inferior, who gets to decide what happens and how it impacts on which bodies in the world. Okay, so this is the kind of thing that I need you to be cognizant of. Okay, so here, if you look at these 9 forms of domination and exploitation, it really starts to unravel where power, the coloniality of power sits. And again, I mentioned that most of you would be interested in the coloniality of knowledge, but actually, if you look at knowledge, is another form of exploitation, and epistemic knowledge and power, or linguistic knowledge and power, sits here as well. So these terms are not isolated, they integrate and they influence each other. So we have race, gender, religion, linguistics, class, sexuality, ethnicity, political, military, and epistemic. To clarify epistemic, epistemic means the study of knowledge in the world. How do we know what we know? Okay, and then ontology is a way of being. How do we be? If someone else can add to my definitions, please do so. I myself am not a theorist or a social scientist. My background is in occupational therapy, and I've come to public health, and I've come to this knowledge to really deepen my understanding of how to practice in health a lot with an approach of social justice. And I think I'd like to encourage all of us to understand that this kind of knowledge is not beyond us. It is important that we trust that we need to learn this knowledge no matter where our background comes from. And that because many of us, especially those of us who come from the African continent, have experience of these forms of power and domination. And so remembering that we are part of the story. So put yourself into these forms of the ways in which these domination and exploitation play out. And that's the only way to be truly reflexive. So I want to go into an example, and I told Joel that I'm going to use health as an example because this is my field, but that I would encourage all of you to extrapolate to your own understanding. So an example of coloniality of power in health is this idea of the funding that comes from the US to many lower middle income countries, particularly for women's reproductive health. And we have presidents of the United States, starting with George W. Bush, that actually were very against abortion for his own religious reasons that were tied to his elections and tied to his forms of power. And so he decided that all money donated in the form of development funds to any country that the US sends money to cannot use the money for reproductive health, particularly for abortion. And so they instituted the global gag rule. But then we had immediately different presidents, and each of them shared different value systems. So Obama was supportive of abortion rights, and he took away the gag rule. President Trump was very much in favor of the gag rule. And President Biden, in January 2021, he repealed the global gag rule. So you see in this case how global forces, especially in the US and in the superpowers, impact on the reality of women in post-colonial countries. How certain women are more affected than others. So it's racialized and othered women in the lower socioeconomic groups who are mostly impacted because if they cannot get the services through the development aid structure, they don't have the financial means to get these services. And this is a form of domination and control. It's grounded in the colonial construct of religion, and it's tied with religious and epistemic control. And so you see a foreign policy impact national policy, and value system of the US counts. And in this case, money is instrumentalized as power. And I want to introduce a term which is quite relevant to our topic. And I suppose I'd encourage all of you to consider examining how this term plays out in your field. And the term is structural violence or institutional violence. And this, I would say, where a president, based on his value system, decides to make a decision that impacts on so many women's lives, is shifting the structure and then influences the way in which that structure can be violent towards women and children. And I suppose even our universities can be considered structural violent. And in the field of health, many of our healthcare settings that are quite unsupportive of women or different bodies, maybe queer bodies or sex workers or teenagers, can be also structurally violent. So other examples in the health sector is around the ways in which coloniality of power is played out in the decisions that maybe presidents make. So you see that newspaper article on the top where the South African president decided that only South African citizens will get the vaccine, not foreign migrants. So it's an immediate discrimination against a particular vulnerable group. Again, we've seen with coronavirus how these global bodies like the World Bank, the World Health Organization, the United Nations, a lot of the power sits with them and how they make decisions. And we saw how countries like China and America and UK make decisions that impact on all of us, right? So we need to ask who determines the agenda, where does patriarchy sit, who determines policies, and how do these hierarchies from north to south play out? So then we go to coloniality of knowledge. And remember, this is a lot of the subject of this topic. And so I urge you to go and Google Professor Ramón Grosfoguel and really just listen to him. There's a lot of YouTube clips, there's a lot of reading he's written, and he's urging us to go back to the structure of knowledge to really understand. And he's got this word epistemicide, okay? And this is an important word because he has urged us to start to begin to be aware of the destruction of many knowledges that occurred during the colonial project. The very fact that this talk is happening in English and not in some of our local languages, and that English has dominated so many parts of the world that my biography, where I come from in India and Kenya, can easily communicate, yet both countries have rich languages that seem to be slightly inferior to English. Why is that? How is knowledge structured? How is language very much a part of the way knowledge is transmitted? So we need to be aware of the coloniality of knowledge, and particularly epistemicides. This is a very violent exercise of the destruction of knowledge. And when we go to some key moments, like in Spain, where a lot of the knowledge libraries were burned in Al-Andalus, that is part of the destruction of knowledge. So coloniality of knowledge refers to the process of domination of the knowledge over the production and patterns of knowledge, and it determines which knowledge is considered a legitimate way of understanding the world. Now look at this image. What you see here again is most likely a country in the East, with another white man who's examining a child's body, and you have people kind of looking over, this is part of the ways in which we have come to be controlled, to be influenced as to who are the knowledge holders and who are not knowledge holders. But is this really true? This is what we need to examine. So it's about an epistemological colonization of both mind and imagination. And again, to come back to Sabelo Ndlovu-Kacheni, he says that at the core of decoloniality is the agenda of shifting the geography and biography of knowledge. Who generates knowledge and from where? So I urge all of us to look at people who look like us as knowledge holders and knowledge creators. And we come back to the same example of Donald Trump, where the example of the abortion rights, where he instituted the gag rule. And the way that Trump had convinced the US population is right at the outset when he was elected. In his inauguration speech, he spoke about moral virtuosity, he spoke about American values, and he actually demonstrated really quite explicitly that he actually doesn't care. And he said on an interview, well, these people, you will have to just go back to a position where people will have to use illegal places, which really shows us that Donald Trump does not actually care about what women have to go through when they go into an illegal abortion clinic. And there's no consideration for why these women may have needed an abortion in the first place. Maybe a woman was raped. Maybe there was many legitimate reasons. The point is, it's not up to a man who lives in a country in the global north to decide for another woman what's right for their bodies and what's not right for their bodies. And I think that value system is entrenched in many of us, where we start deciding for the other what is right and what is not right. And developing that praxis of reflexivity helps us to examine, but where did that idea come from? Why am I encouraging this particular agenda? And is it actually fair for me to impose onto another person? So whose ideas count? Where do imposed views come from? How do we impose views onto others? What is the knowledge that informs policy-making processes? How do the management structures then, adapt to implement these value systems? Where are unconscious biases? And in the case of this example of abortion, many women who undertake an abortion are sitting with shame and sin and judgment without recognizing the structural position that these women are existing or living in that may have led them to this position where they have to consider abortion. And many women do not have the ability to speak to their partner and request their partner uses protection, for example, or condom use. They cannot negotiate some of these things. And so they end up in a position that compromises their future, and this becomes unfair. So to quickly push on, because time is short, there are other examples of how coloniality of knowledge comes in, but I'm going to try and ask you in your own field to consider how racial stereotypes are perpetuated, how the bias investment and production of knowledge exists, how certain fields are encouraged. So, people consider science over the social sciences, and methodologies, certain methodologies like randomized cluster control trials versus qualitative studies are more important. We always consider journals, which journals we publish in, which journals has the most impact factor, which is the most global journal, whereas actually these are forms of power, and we need to start examining who are we writing for. So when I write for a paper for one of the top health journals like The Lancet, who's going to read that journal? So who is my readership, and through which gaze? Am I an African person writing for the white audience or the global north audience? Or am I writing about a topic of health for those that are actually impacted by the health that I'm writing about? So in my case, a lot of my research is in primary healthcare, with community health workers, in gender violence. Do I want these women who experience the violence to read my journal article, or am I writing for an audience that isn't affected by this issue? And that's the ways in which we are very complicit in this entire network and system. And this is where we need to start disrupting. Okay, so the last one is coloniality of being. And this is probably the most dangerous, and it's the one we really need to examine, because it's the denial of the humanity of certain people and the process of inferiorization or dehumanization, where the colonized person is often compared to the white subject. Okay, so ultimately, many of us striving to be other than what we are. We want to be acceptable. We want to have affirmation. We want to be in the limelight. We want to have the power. And so we leave a lot of our selves behind in order to become the other. And the other is usually the white male subject. And we have to start examining, why do we unconsciously strive for that ideal? And are we able to accept ourselves? And to what degree do we accept ourselves? And the Black Lives Matter movement is a particular example of trying to bring about consciousness to the value of Black lives. Okay. Another example, which is particular to India, is where the most superior being in India is actually under a very Hindu extremist situation, is actually this particular type of caste, which is the Brahmin caste, is the most superior. And so if you are Muslim, for example, you become the other. So it's not to say it's only the white man, but it's in every different context, we need to examine, how does power play out, and who becomes the more dominant, and who is inferior, and so on. So let's start to be reflexive in what we do, right? In South Africa, this idea of xenophobia is something that we are struggling with, where we've moved from apartheid structure to a kind of democracy, which is actually still a white settler colonial space, but often we find that foreign migrants experience the inferiorization as well and dehumanization, along with the majority Black communities in the South African population, right? And Indigenous Lives Matter is something that's really coming up in the decolonial discourse. So Steve Bantu Biko, I'm sure many of you know him, a South African Black consciousness scholar, and he really was quite clear that the most potent weapon in the minds of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. And so it's about examining how we are oppressed, okay? And this means we need to start watching what we do, how we think, in the language of our thoughts, and the ideas that we embody, where do they come from? And in this issue of reproductive health, where abortion is stigmatized, or women who need to go and access abortion services, reproductive justice is not upheld. Women's bodies are controlled, and violence is meted out onto women's bodies who don't have the agency to either make decisions about their reproductive lives, and also their financial, economic, and social futures, which are so tied into a patriarchal structure. Okay, so ultimately, if you look at this image on the side, you see this white man that's saying abortion hurts women, but this woman standing next to him saying, but it's my body and my choice. So these are the value systems that sit in conflict, and really we need to examine them clearly and understand what is the more social justice way forward. So there's another example that I'm not going to go into, but it's really around, maybe I will just a little, because your topic is on methodology. But this example is examining Black women academics' experiences in South African institutions of higher learning. And I urged you to think of the term structure of violence in institutions. And so in South Africa, many of our institutions of higher learning were not built for Black bodies. They were built for white people under the apartheid structure. So it becomes very difficult for many Black women to enter into these institutions and become knowledge producers and knowledge holders. And many of them feel insecure, they feel imposter syndrome, they experience racialized encounters, they feel gaslit. There's many experiences that really dehumanize them. And the Rhodes Must Fall, and particularly the Rhodes Must Fall movement, is actually stopping South African institutions in their track and saying, we actually need to stop this system of violence, and we need to be better for the women and for the large majority of South Africans in our country. So I'm hoping that this lecture has inspired you into going on a journey to open your minds to reading decolonial theory. I've mentioned quite a few scholars, and I'm hoping that this will set the tone for an incredible summer school that you're about to embark on. Thank you. I hand over to Joel now.
Thank you so much, Shehnaz. Always inspiring to start, to think about these actual examples that are happening in the continent and, in the global south, some of the experiences in there. And importantly, your message brings in the question about scholarship. How do we, the scholarship bit of it, the understanding and the research that is fundamental in terms of decoloniality. Thanks for that. There are a few questions in the chat. I think I'll start from one from Ali. He says that how can African governments and by extension the African Union counter coloniality so that the citizens in the continent can shed off the colonial values? Is there almost like magic to this, or are there some steps that we can use towards that? Then I'll also include another one that he says, so long as African countries' educational system are controlled by colonialists, and this speaks to the final point that you made about the institution of higher learning, it will be somehow difficult to move forward. And what is your take in this space of, almost like we are maintaining the colonial, geopolitical colonialism in the way it is? There is also a comment from Olga. So he starts with health and education systems and other social and economic systems are based on institutions created or rather developed by colonial countries in general. Can we talk about decolonization with these institutions? Like, can we start a conversation with this institution? Should they be changed, altered, or all to? And if yes, to what? What kind of alteration would we be looking towards? Basically, to something totally new or something improved. Anyway, to you, three questions in there. Yeah.
Okay, so these are really fascinating questions, and I suppose the idea is to think together. When it comes to governments, I think we have to understand that many of the African governments form part of this global governance structure. And many of the financial decisions the governments make are influenced by their own need for power, but also a kind of global hierarchy of power. And unfortunately, many African governments, some still pay a fee, like they still pay a tax, like especially the Francophone countries. And many are still suffering from the impacts of structural adjustment programs, which took place in the 70s. And so you've got to look at the global context in which African governments operate. And we also need to look at the ways in which the funding structures, these NGOs, and these global initiatives, including the UN, the World Bank, IMF, and in health, the WA, not so much WA, but maybe the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the World Food Program, the Gavi Alliance. Many of them operate in ways that almost make governments, departments dependent on the aid that comes from the outside, and allow the governments to be less responsible for service delivery, basic service delivery. So we look at it as aid and we think, oh, wow, we're so lucky to have, the World Food Program coming to give us food, and the Gavi Alliance. But when we stop and sit back and we think about the wealth of resources that African countries have, mineral resources, the sun, the soil, the intelligence of the people on Africa, we should sit back and wonder, why? Why do we need money from the north? Why is most of our resources going there to the north, where they make profit, and then they send a small amount of money in aid back to us so that we can use it just to alleviate poverty and hunger? So it's much broader. And I think African governments and the African Union are really not doing enough. South Africa is a perfect example where we had an anti-apartheid government that upheld many social justice goals, and we have an incredible constitution. But more than 20 years later, from the end of apartheid, we're sitting with a government that, is complicit in the death of Black bodies, like the Marikana massacre. We have a health minister who was complicit in corruption of COVID-19 funds. And it baffles the mind as to why these leaders who were so revolutionary at the outset as young people have now come into the seat of power and are unable to lead and direct us to the emancipation of Africa and to shifting the power in Africa, and to disrupt this idea that we are dependent on the North. So I think that what was interesting with COVID-19 is that the virus attacked China, and then it went quite a lot to America and Italy and Europe. And it disrupted the idea that health and disease emits and exists in the disease backward, barbaric Africa, right? And it shifted us all outside of that trope, that unconscious bias that we Africans are so dependent and needy and can't get ourselves together. I think these are part of the tropes that we've been fed. We absorb these ideas and we've internalized them. And I don't know that it's up to governments to change. I believe we're all responsible. And if we really want our governments to be to be doing better, we actually need to demand. We need to demand. We need to be as brave as the feeds must fall and the roads must fall students. We need to stop these institutions of power in their tracks. We need to, literally be the revolution. and I think that's a difficult thing to do, because ultimately many of us need jobs and we want to survive and we want to, look after our families. So we get employed in many of these global health initiatives and take home a salary because many of us are educated. But we have to sit and examine, what are we compromising in this process? Yeah. So I hope that answers the question about governments. Then there's a question about educational system. I mean, ultimately, the Rhodes University, sorry, there's a sun streak coming from the side. This is Rhodes University. And so in all the English colonies, South Africa, Kenya, Uganda, etc., if you look at the educational systems, the institutions of higher learning, they are replicas of those in England. And that's your first step. But actually, when we start shifting our thinking, shifting the paradigm to knowledge holders, perhaps we need to consider our mothers, our grandmothers, our uncles, our plants, our trees, our land, our different ways and forms of knowledge. Who do we turn to for ideas? Whose ideas do we value? And I think when we totally take our ways out of these institutions of higher learning as the pinnacle of knowledge, then we may be able to start to shift the balance and say, well, actually, these institutions are useful and they serve us in these ways, but there are other knowledge that we need to consider and be useful. And then we can start to imagine a new future. And this question of what are we aiming for? Where do we go? What do we want? It is the question of the decolonial theorists. And I would say that decoloniality is being used in dangerous ways. And I'd like to warn us not to be so idealized by the term, because many times these terms become dangerous. So they get picked up by those who are in power, and they define the terms for us, And what I just attended a talk with a group of feminists, and the feminists were really frustrated with the idea that decoloniality is not pushing an agenda that many feminists have been pushing for the longest time. And so women are being left out of the decolonial discourse. So be careful of jumping onto this bandwagon as the ticket to the future. And perhaps we have to admit that human beings are fallible and human beings use and abuse power in different ways. And perhaps whatever new way of being we will create, there will be power imbalances, always. But we have to examine how, as we move forward, how we are becoming dominating, how we are becoming exploitative. And then in that process of reflexivity, we may, the new way may emerge. But I don't have that answer. None of us have that answer right now. It's a good question. Yeah. I'm going to stop there. Sorry. Sure.
Yeah, I mean, it actually builds into some of the questions that are coming up, almost like thinking, what are the practical things that we can actually do? I mean, Marina is asking something about that if COVID was an opportunity to have a discussion, deeper discussions that reflect about global health equity, for example, and that if it is an opportunity, then how should people respond? How should researchers respond? And I'm adding to that in the sense that what can early career researchers, what can researchers practically do? Early career practitioners, policymakers, what can we do? I mean, I think we're also running out of time a bit, but really thinking about that, what are some of the practical things that we can do to move us an inch so that we actually stand a chance in pursuit of decoloniality in this sense?
This is not a 5-second question. And I think this is the frustrating part of doing a talk that goes back to the theory, where it doesn't allow us to deep dive into some of the praxis examples, of the ways in which people are coming up with alternative futures. So I would like to say, for example, in my research, we we are looking at decolonial methodology, and we are reading some of there's a book by a New Zealander scholar, I think, a Maori scholar, who I forget her name right now, but I will let Jules know, where she gives practical examples of how we can actually shift methodology to be more transparent. The other thing is join a social movement that is a decolonial social movement. You know, some of the scholars are saying, don't take money from when you can see that this is going to, you know, perpetuate colonial tropes. Start reading Ngugi wa Thiong'o, start reading African scholars like Sylvia Tamale, like Lance Luskiter, like Pumla Tola, like you know, there's many African scholars. Start shifting your mindset away from publishing in journals that are stuck in the north. There are many things we can begin to do, but you know, the first thing that this lecture was trying to achieve is to make us aware that our ways of doing is actually autopilot. We are not conscious. We need to begin to read. And I think if you read, and you read feminist scholars, read decolonial scholars, go out and protest with the, you know, in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement, with, you know, with Western Sahara is currently colonized. We've got to raise these issues in more instrumental ways. There's a lot to do, and I just don't know if I have the, you know, particular way. And my message is, be reflexive, be conscious, and begin to read, and you will. Let's have a follow-up conversation, I suppose, Joe, where we can, you know, hear from others who are already doing. And I just want to say before I stop talking is that in the Africa Decolonial Conference, we had 3 days. The first day was to also bring up some of the theory. The second day was to discuss some of the paradigm shift in health. And the third day, we had a few incredible women talk about praxis. And I'll send the link because they deep dive into this question of what to do.
Thank you so much, Shehnaz. It's been a really great honor listening to you, and I know there's a bit more questions in there in the chat and all that, but in the interest of time, and we really appreciate your lecture. I think many people are really commenting about how inspirational it was, and it's really much appreciated for this. We are doing this also in the middle of the summer school, and we're just starting. Today is our day one. And I believe that some of the participants have had something to really inspire them throughout the week as we continue discussing different nuances of this. We get to discuss things about challenging power. We get to discuss things about you know, the whole what you brought about feminism, scholarly activism. So we'll get an opportunity to reflect on this further. So we really do appreciate your time, and thank you everybody for attending this session. We must say that it was one of those things that when you start and you listen through, and we were having a conversation with Shehnaz last week, you know, reflecting on how the lecture would go, and I was very inspired, and I continue to be inspired. She's sharing further materials also in the chat, so if you can have a look at that, it will be also resourceful. As part of what was done in the movement from their work the other year. So the take-home message being, do something, start doing something, contribute objectively towards solutions that can lead us to a decoloniality kind of pathway. I think with this, I thank you so much, Shehnaz.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I'm going to send one more resource, just the textbook that I mentioned, just before I forget. And take care. I wish you the best for the summer school. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you, and bye. Well, for the summer school participants joining in person, of course, you know, the program goes on. For the summer school participants who are only joining virtually, We start again tomorrow morning with a lecture from Frank, who was also in this discussion. Thank you very much and have a great evening. Please, the hosts, you don't end the meeting yet until people have had an opportunity to get some of the things posted in the chat. Thank you and have a great evening.